and began my introduction to compost toilets, gray water, and rainwater harvesting while she lived in Wise Island by herself for 5 years. We met. 3 months later, we were engaged. 3 months after we were engaged, we were married, and then 6 months later, we moved to a damaged piece of property, and we decided to build as sustainably as we could. In terms of doing that, there are many different aspects of our house which are tied to the Eco-Sense house. And but one of the biggest things that we participated in was something called the Living Building Challenge, which is sort of the most stringent green building rating system internationally. And out of many different aspects of the Living Building Challenge, such as everything from zero waste to zero carbon and all that sort of stuff, is also a net zero water balance. And when it comes to water, we had to learn a lot. And what that has done is we have tried to work and live net zero water for many different aspects of our lifestyle. And that also means that I do multiple things. We have a farm and a nursery, which starts to get busy this time of the year. We are co-authors of the Essential Composting Toilets book, which is a bit of a nerdy look at compost toilets. And I'm also a municipal councillor in the District of Highlands, and I'm the vice chair of the CRD Regional Water Supply. So water plays a big part of everything I do. And even as the president of the BC Fruit Testers Association, I spend a lot of time with people trying to help them choose the right rootstocks that require the least amount of water. Also design small water systems, potable rainwater systems, or right policy. And so I do a lot of stuff with water. Rainwater is probably what I do the most of. Rainwater is an interesting topic because there's a lot of, I guess there's a lot of, there's a lot of ambiguity around rainwater, and I'd like to say that just because rainwater falls from the sky doesn't necessarily mean that the rainwater is safe. We're pretty lucky. We've got a great airshed on Galiano and all through the Gulf Islands and Vancouver Island. But if we go to the mainland and we go to Chilliwack or Hope or places like that, when the rain falls from the sky, it does filter out a lot of pollutants. And so we have to be conscious that when we're talking about rainwater, we need to be thinking about what is in that rainwater potentially, what is it being used for, and so there's a lot of things to think about. And the more that I've gotten into this over the past many years, there's more information that comes forward. And rainwater is something where I think the majority of people, given the right information, will be able to do a lot of the stuff themselves. But there's also a lot of misinformation on the internet, which can be concerning. And I like to look at the picture to the right of the screen, where we've got probably some lead flashing going into an old bucket, and that is not the best way of collecting rainwater. And you'll understand why by the end of the presentation. And with that, there's an increasing body of knowledge around the health and risks of rainwater harvesting. So it's important just to understand what those are and some of the unforeseen implications around the safety aspects, which I'll touch on that as well. So in good fashion, Rorschach fashion, this is an ink blot. And many of you can look at that ink blot and come up with your own idea of what you see. I'm going to say that that policy kind of looks a lot like a big ink blot. There's a lot of lack of clarity. The standards in the past have left policy all over the map. And I am going to start really briefly by discussing policy, because policy is important if we're going into water systems that are potable water systems for houses or public water systems or things like that. But the policy that governs potable water systems also has a lot of important things around non-potable systems. And we see policy throughout the region that is developing, the Regional District of Nanaimo, the Catchment Valley Regional District, Victoria, CRD, Islands Trust has developed some stuff that I've worked on with them for Salt Spring Island, but we are beginning to see policy change. The other thing that has changed, which now anybody that is going to be doing a do-it-yourself rainwater system isn't going to be accessing this standard, but this standard is great information, and a lot of what you're going to see today is basically going to be a sort of a watered down version of what is going to be in the Canadian rainwater standard. Standard's interesting because this is actually the very first standard out of right in the US and Canada where they've actually worked on a standard together. This one just happens to be, hold on a second, phone, turn it off. My apologies. The rainwater standard is just happens to be about rainwater. So what there is now is that if you are having to hire a professional to do your rainwater, there is an international standard that governs it and that engineers use it or professionals of that are doing design and installations use. And it covers everything from single family houses, which is what most of us are dealing with, right, to multi-family residential to commercial. So it's pretty cool in Canada that we are seeing the understanding that rainwater can be used for not just single family, but also multi-family and commercial. That's a really big step. And professionals are legally bound by this standard to follow it. There are many other regulations which govern if you're doing things sort of above board for potable systems or larger community systems that will apply, such as the BC Building and Plumbing Codes. The BC Provincial Rainwater Guidelines were just released this summer, and there's also local bylaws. Okay, so there's a real brief run through of the policy and some of the regulations without going into detail, just that they exist. And I'll leave it up to you whether you follow through with that or not, but at least now you know that if you do want to go through and deal with anything, and you do want to go by permits and stuff like that, that there is stuff out there that you need to be aware of. So the pre-design process, and I'm going to say that, you know, even if you're doing a do-it-yourself system, or if I'm doing a sort of a professionally designed system, following sort of the same process will lead to better outcomes and a bit more of an organized approach. And so the first thing you want to do is you want to assess what your needs are. You know, are you dealing with a potable system, which is, you know, for drinking water or showers or washing vegetables, or are you dealing with a non-potable system? For irrigation, are you dealing with a system that's just designed for fire suppression? And so assess your needs. And then the next step is you need to take a look at your site. And the importance of looking at your site is to assess, one, you know, you can assess the air shed. So for example, if we go back to that other picture, which was, you know, some pretty nasty air, is that air shed going to be suitable if you want to have a potable water system? Yeah, probably not. Not unless you got a pretty beefy filtration system. But, you know, also, is your site got some flat spots for tanks to be stored? What is the surrounding land use? Do you have lots of trees? Is there a pulp mill beside you? And so you want to be able to do a site assessment and think about what's going on around you to help you assess if you can meet your needs. And then comes the fun stuff, which is also begins to look at where the costs are in a rainwater system, and you'll need to know. You'll want to do a water budget, and that will tell you how much water you need, and then you want to do a water balance based on a variety of different things, and that will determine the size of the storage. And when you know the size of your storage, that will also help you determine your cost, because storage is kind of the most expensive part of a rainwater system. And a water safety plan or a water plan, basically for yourself, what that might mean is it might mean a 1 or a 2-page set of notes that guide you in designing your system and what you're trying to get out of it. It might include the calculations that you did for your water budget. It might look at the, what areas, when I call a control point, for example, what areas are you trying to filter things out of your system? We'll talk about that in a little bit more later on. And then there is doing the design. And so design drawings can be really simple 1-page design drawings, or they can be more complicated depending on the system. Not all systems have to have complicated drawings. And then it's not a bad idea to have some sort of a little user's manual. And when I say that, there's nothing worse than building something, whether I do it or whether you do it, and to install it, and then 5 or 10 years later you need to move out, either due to age or due to a difference, whatever goes on in your life, and the new people come in and they don't know where the pipes are laid in the ground, they don't know where to find the replacement filters, they don't know anything. So it's not a bad idea to have basically a little guidebook, so that whoever runs into this system that is installed knows what it's doing, what it's intended for, and how to service it. So those are sort of some really quick, upfront, sort of good basic concepts to have. And now, as I mentioned, there are 2 types of rainwater systems. There's non-potable rainwater systems, and those are the systems that are not intended for consumption. And it means that there's really going to be a low possibility for accidental consumption. So, for example, if you've got a rainwater system that is hooked to a hose bib outside your house, and it's not labeled as non-potable, somebody could be visiting, their kids could be thirsty on a sunny day, and they could take a sip of non-potable water and they could get sick. So we have to think about, if we're dealing with a non-potable system, what is the chances of consumption and how do we minimize those? And with non-potable, there's different levels of how we determine how to treat it. And if we're collecting rainwater, for example, for use as a fire suppressant, an emergency fire suppressant, there's no treatment that's needed. You can, fire department's going to roll up, they're going to grab their water and they're going to spray. And if you're dealing with something that is, say, a sprinkler irrigation system that has public access to it and a play park to it and things like that, then there's a much more likely chance of accidental consumption. So you have to think about, how's the water being used? What is the potential risk to the public and things like that? When we get to potable water, anything that is in essence going to come into contact and being ingested, that includes showers and sinks, food prep, and places where there's public access and public irrigation. So even though irrigation might be considered a non-potable purpose, because of a public space, it has you have to treat it with a bit more caution. Don't remember this slide. This is just to run through what it looks like for me when I do a design. So under, I think my arrow is showing up here. So for non-potable, there's sort of 3 tiers for non-potable, and there's 1 tier for potable water use. And inside those tiers, basically what we are dealing with is where the end uses are, and the end uses up in this part of the table are the ones with the least likelihood of causing injury to people, and the ones down here in the potable section are the ones most likely to that we have to be conscientious of in how we handle the water. And when we look at the at why they're tiered, it's because there's different types of exposure that can occur. And some of these are pretty rare and unlikely to be exposed, and some of these are pretty certain to have exposure. So that's where where that prior slide that I talked about comes into play. Now, there's things in common with potable and non-potable water systems. There's sort of four main areas. There's the collection area, which is going to be whatever the surface area is that you're collecting your rainwater from. There's going to be the conveyance, and that is basically getting the water from the roof or your collection area to your storage tanks and any pre-filtration. There's going to be the storage system, and there's going to be how you supply it. But the way that these look, it will be very different between potable and non-potable. For example, on the right-hand side of your screen, when we start looking at what is going to be different for a potable system is materials, standards for potability of the different components and pipes, your storage design, how you do risk mitigation, documentation is going to be more complex, treatment is going to be more complex, and yearly testing is going to be an important thing to do. So a lot of very basic things in common, but when you get to potable, there's a bit more involved. So I talked really briefly about the collection area, and so I'll be talking about the collection area. I'll be talking about the conveyance, which is basically getting it from the collection area to the tanks, talking about storage, and talking about supply. So I'm going to move on because, so we'll start with catchment. And so this is normally where if I'm in there in person, I would make the comment that size matters, and that usually causes some laughter in the audience. But it does, and size is the amount of area, it's the footprint, and we'll talk about that. And then precipitation is obviously the amount of rainwater that's going to fall on the area that's collecting. We'll talk about the materials, site vegetation, and the surrounding land use. So catchment size, basically, we might have a roof that is got maybe very steep roof, so it might have a lot of metal on it, but ultimately the catchment area is the footprint of the roof area. And so what you would do is you basically take a measurement of your roof area, and you're going to get what your area is. I like to use square meters rather than feet because even though I was raised on imperial, metric is so much easier to use. But anyways, this is sort of the first thing you want to do is to find out what your catchment size is that you're going to be collecting from. And just for those out there, that 1 square meter, if you have 1 millimeter of rain that lands on 1 square meter, that equals 1 potential liter of water that you can collect. So it kind of gives you an idea. That's why I like to use metric. It keeps everything really simple. So precipitation. Oh, poor slide, Gord. I meant to change that. Precipitation, you can get your precipitation information from a variety of different sources. Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium has it. Island Weather, that has some of the island weather stations, has it, which is run through UVic, or there is the Canadian, the federal government weather portal that you can go through and gain access to. But basically what's going to happen over here is just a picture of a poor picture of my monthly precipitation. And so I'm going to collect out what my average monthly precipitation is. And I might have my roof area up top here. And that is going to be useful information, which we'll move on to in a few slides. This is the Victoria School-Based Weather Station Network. That this is just for the Saanich Peninsula, but they also have the Gulf Islands as well. And it's pretty good because it has really updated information. It's not necessarily based on some of the historical rainfall patterns, and we really are seeing changes to the historical averages in the past 15 to 20 years. This is the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. This is the one I use. It's much more detailed. I use it because it has thousands of more weather stations on it, and I can then get 3 weather stations and average out them for an area and have a more accurate figure. And this is the Government of Canada site. So moving on, the next thing with regards to catchment is the materials. And this is something which is really, I think many people don't realize the importance of your roofing material in your catchment. Not quite so critical for a non-potable system, but most of the systems I deal with are for potable. And many of the roofs that people want to collect water off for potable purposes might have a product on them that is not suitable for collecting potable rainwater. And I'll point to 2 slides, 2 of the squares here. We've got clay tiles. We probably, I don't know what that is. We've got slate, we've got metal. Right here, we've got asphalt shingle. Asphalt shingle has been treated. And if you're collecting for potable rainwater, having our slightly acidic rainwater come across the surface of asphalt shingles and go into your tanks is going to rinse out things like fire retardants and other contaminants, which you really don't want to drink. And ironically, even though cedar shake is nice and it's considered natural, if you're picking it up from a building supply store, chances are it's been sprayed with a fire retardant, and we really don't need to ingest any more fire retardants. Ultimately, the best thing if you're collecting rainwater, and I think I've got that on my next slide, it's going to be things like metal, solar panels, fiberglass roofs. I won't go through the list that you see here, but in the Living Building Challenge, there's something that's called the red list, and they're all the chemicals that you're not allowed to use in your house, which are everything on the right is stuff that's commonly used in the house. So when we are choosing a roof for potable water, we want to focus on a material that is good. And one of the things that is probably the best is going to be the metal roofing. That's not to say that all metal roofing is equal. There are 3 coatings on metal roofs that are really good, and one is called silicon modified polyester. One is called PVDF, which is even better, and the other one is ceramic. And the nice thing about these ones is that they don't break down very much over time, which is important because usually the primer that is underneath these coatings is chrome based. And so if we have a poor, even though the paint might not be toxic, if we've got a poor paint that gets chalky over time and starts to allow the primer to show, then we're actually going to be pulling chrome into our water system. It's not good. And galvanized is another one which actually many people used to think galvanized was the best. But galvanized has a lot of zinc, and even though we don't see the cadmium in the galvanized process anymore, it does leach out because of the acidic rainwater that we have, and so you would be collecting higher amounts of zinc, and so you might have to do more testing or test for zinc in your water, and or extra filtering. Solar panels are great. If you have a roofing system that is not ideal for what you want to use it for, you can buy sealers that you can apply to your roof that are what are called NSF 151. Sorry, it's a number, but basically it means that it's certified for rainwater for potable purposes. So if you are deciding to collect rainwater, you don't want to replace your roof, but you do have a roof that can be sealed, then here's where you can go to find something that you can apply to your roof that allows you to block any potential nasties from ending up in your water collection. I won't say much to this because I've already sort of touched on it earlier, when I was talking about Chilliwack. Um, but when you're looking at your catchment and you're looking at what the rain has to fall through or what's going to land on your roof and what is your rain going to rinse off your roof, you want to be thinking about things like pollen. And pollen is, it gets really heavy at a certain point in time in the season. So if you've got a really heavy pollen load where you are, there might be a point in time where maybe 2 or 3 weeks in the springtime, you have what we call a bypass where you can just pull a handle and any of the really heavily pollen laden water that's coming off your roof just rinses away and doesn't go into your tank. So you can do things like that. You also want to take a look at the amount of debris overhanging your roof. So if you've got a lot of leaves or things like that, it means that you're going to be having more tannins in your water. So you might want to be trimming things back. You might want to have roof gutters. And bird load is a really interesting one because most people don't think about it. And I was doing a system design in behind Mears Island in Cypress Bay, and they have a beautiful air shed up there. It's on the west coast of the island, just off of Tofino. And anyways, they've got probably 9 months out of the year, 10 months out of the year, they've got the best air shed that I've ever had to work with. But because it's right by a river and it's a salmon spawning river, they have a couple months where there is a lot of bird poo that lands on the roof. And so you have to think about things like, okay, what is the bird load? It's high nitrogen. What can be in it? What else is going to land in it? What's going to end up in your water system? So you think about things like that. And you also want to think about, is there a farm beside you? Do they use agricultural sprays? Is there any industrial pollution? Chimneys and flues. What are you burning? Things like that. So understanding the local conditions helps you design whether you want to use that water for the purpose that you intended it for, or whether you need to ensure that you filter it for certain aspects. This is one where there's not a lot of vegetation here. There's a little bit. There's some street traffic here. So we're in a city. We might have some pollution from in a city that we might want to think about. This is one in Shawnigan Lake, which is a farm, a lot higher pollen loading, but because of all the agricultural activities and the farm animals, we didn't end up doing a rainwater system here because it would have been too much maintenance and too much cost per residence. So we decided to use a well system, but that's an example where we've looked at the air shed and the land use and made a determination of what we can use. Conveyance. So that is once the water comes off your roof, it is basically from the gutters to your storage. And conveyance, there is a couple main aspects of conveyance. Again, materials is important depending on if you're going to have a potable water system or if you're not going to have a potable water system. Obviously, if it's a potable water system, there are certain materials that you'll need to use. And if it's non-potable, you have a lot more flexibility and can use cheaper materials. And I'll touch on that. I'll also touch on water flow off the roof. This is one which sealing against vermin. We'll be talking about that. Pre-filtration, dealing with fine debris and coarse debris off the roof, and other design concepts tied to conveyance. So we will move on to the next slide. Now, I won't talk so much about non-potable because there really is no restrictions with the materials you can use for non-potable systems. But if you are going with a potable water system, any of the piping that you use has to be NSF 61 or potable water certified piping. That looks like SCED 40 PVC. Do I hear someone in the background? Is that you, Adam? No? Okay. It looks like SCED 40 PVC or Class 200 PVC or any potable rated piping system. Going to be much more expensive than a non-rated pipe that you might be using. But if we think about sewer pipe that might be used, that somebody might use, like the drain waste vent or the sewer drain pipe, that is used for, burying around foundations to house to move your storm water and your perimeter drains around your house. Many years that piping was extruded in the factory with lead molds, and so there's many cases where some of these older pipes, because it's less regulated, will have chemicals in it that are not suitable for potable water, despite the fact that they're white, despite the fact that they say PVC on them. Certified potable water piping is certified because they know it doesn't have items that are going to cause and harm to the drinking water system. With pumps are going to be more expensive for a potable water system because you're going to be either going with an NSF 61 pump and a low lead pump, or if it's not rated, then a stainless steel pump. Your filters will be rated for potable water, and all the components will be potable and low lead or stainless. So potable water systems generally are about 2 to maybe 3 times the price of a non-potable system because the materials are more expensive. Now, this is something where I'm not going to go into this in detail, but if you are wanting to figure out the size of your gutters, the size of your downspouts, and how big the pipes need to be, the person that you hire, the contractor that you hire to put your gutters on and your downspouts, they will go through these tables and they will know what the best size gutter is to service the amount of area that you're collecting from. They'll know what size downspouts need to be there so that the water can get down the downspouts without spilling over the gutters. And they'll also know what any horizontal sections of pipe, what size the piping needs to be. So this is something where, as a rule of thumb, if you're doing it yourself, stick to 5-inch gutters, stick to 2.5. So if your gutters are here and you don't want to go through those, but you're wondering what to do, if you've got 5-inch gutters and you've got 2.5-inch pipe and you've got 4-inch pipe down here for the horizontal, you're going to be ensured that you're really not going to have any issues with water getting to where it needs to go. This is important. Your conveyance system, every spot on your conveyance system needs to be sealed from vermin. That includes politicians, insects, rodents, birds, debris. And so what's also useful with this is that with your conveyance, when you're sealing it for all these access points, this really ties right into how you're pre-filtering the water before it goes into the tank. And so it can start, if you've got gutters and you've got gutter guards, you want to make sure that your gutter guards are sealed so you can't get mosquitoes in there, which means you've got to be, you've got to pay attention to detail. If you don't have gutter guards, then when your downspouts come down, you can drain your downspouts into a leaf catcher. And again, what this is doing is this is making sure this is sealed so you're not getting rodents in there. So this can be a replacement for gutter guards. This is a fancier version of a filter that goes in your downspout. This is like a little vortex filter. This is about 4 times as expensive as that little gutter guard. This is about this would be about $300 what you're looking at, and I never use them because they're just too darn expensive. This is a type of a filter that goes on top of a tank, and inside here there are screens and filters so that rodents and things cannot get into the tank. So it gives you a good clean seal to your tank. There's other types of filters where the water can come through, it can drain through a screen, and there's a little trap door on this end so that, if a mouse happens to come up backwards through your overflow pipe, they're not going to be able to climb into your water tank and go swimming in your pool. And there's also more expensive filters tied for bigger, tied to some underground plumbing and things like that, like this vortex filter, which is also vermin proof. So there's many different ways to keep your system sealed, and you can use whatever filter system that you want to use as your protection. And
hey, Gord.
yes.
Quick question for you, since everybody else is being shy. I'm imagining a lot of us here are going to do, there's probably some folks who are really interested in potable systems, but a lot of us are thinking non-potable for gardens. I just installed one really quickly at my house the other day, and right now I have a kitchen sieve as a filter on top of it. What are your thoughts on kitchen sieves?
My thought on a kitchen sieve is, and it depends on the amount of water coming through, but if you were using it for irrigating your garden, if your kitchen sieve is something that you can easily look at, easily clean, but you can also make sure that that kitchen sieve can't be pushed up by a mouse that's wondering what's underneath the kitchen sieve, then it could be good. But what you can also do is there are little simple basket strainers that you can buy, which is basically like a kitchen sieve. It's a little bit bigger, and it's got a little bit of a mesh bag in it, which means that it can also collect the pollen. And then what you do is you just take your mesh bag out, you rinse it, and you put it back in. So a kitchen sieve will still allow a fair bit in there. And so, for example, if you've got a kitchen sieve and say you are then pumping it, that kitchen sieve may allow some sand and aggregate come from your roof if you've got asphalt shingles, perhaps. And then if the water, if that goes into your tank and you're sucking some water out, you've got the potential to pick up some of that sand. It could wear out your pump sooner. But if you are just doing it for irrigation, then you can be more creative about it. And so that could work. Does that help answer your question, Adam?
That answers my question beautifully. Thanks, Gord.
Okay. When you have got a lot of particles in the air, like pollen, and if you're collecting pollen, one of the things that happens is, I'm sure that everybody has seen what their windshield looks like after a big big batch of pollen has blown by for a couple days. And then the first rain comes and they put the windshield washer or the windshield wipers on, and it's just nothing but a smear. So pollen is an organic, and if you get lots of pollen in your water system, it will start to make your water system kind of skunky and come a little bit. Well, if you take organics and water and you put them together and you hold them there long enough, basically you get compost tea. So a first flush diverter is a way of dealing with that initial bit of stuff that lands in your roof that you don't want to store because you're trying to avoid making compost tea. So there's many different ways to doing this. The simplest way, and this is a house, this is a non-potable water system here, where we do not have any gutter guards in the house. So it comes down, we have a really, really simple leaf filter. And then as it heads on its way to the tank, what I have is I just have a sanitary Y. I've got a pipe, and I'll show you what is at the bottom of that pipe in a moment. But there's a little valve down here, or just a little hole at the bottom of the pipe that just slowly drains. And so as the water comes in quicker than the water can drain out. And so the water volume in the pipe fills up, and that fills up with the dirtiest water, so that when it gets up to here, then it goes into your tank and you've got cleaner water in your tank. This is a really, really simple system. It may cost you about $40 max in a rubber coupling and the bits and pieces, or even less. But this is a first flush diverter to deal with pollen. So it can be really, really simple. This is a bit more of a complex system, but the same thing goes. We do not have gutter guards. And I think everybody can see my pointer at the top right-hand corner. So we have a leaf filter, nice, simple leaf filter. And that leaf filter can be a kitchen strainer. It can be a leaf filter. Down here, we've got a valve. And that valve has got a little hole drilled in it, so water always drains out. And can be a small hole. It can be like 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 or a 1/4 inch hole. And so when it rains, the water and the debris get shed off. The debris gets shut off by the filter. This fills up quicker than it drains out. And when it gets to the top, then we've got cleaner water that then goes to the tank. And then this is just an overflow. We won't pay attention to this down here, but this is a really easy system so that if there is rain that comes through, if this house had a really heavy pollen season and they didn't want to collect any water, what they could do is they could just open this valve for 2 weeks of the year right here. This is just pull this. This is like what you see in the bottom of an RV for their gray water and black water. It's just a knife valve. And you can just open this valve up for a couple of weeks, and any rain that comes down here is just going to drain away. And that means you can bypass having to collect any water. So this is another really easy system that you can do to act as a first flush diverter and a bypass all in one.
All right, I see a couple questions out there. I'm
Absolutely.
gonna unmute folks. Suzanne, you've got a question?
Yeah.
Oh, am I still
Suzanne,
there?
are you there?
Oh.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So we live in an area in the North Galiano where we have a lot of a very high pollen load. In fact, it actually doesn't come off our roof unless we have to get it commercially cleaned, which is hard because it's a very steep metal roof.
Yep.
So I guess the value of that valve would be when it's being cleaned, you could just let the water gush out.
Exactly.
But is there a downside to having some pollen? I mean, we would want it only for irrigating the garden. So compost tea sounds kind of appealing in a way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There must be a downside to it.
So, and it depends on how much you're going to collect. But generally, if you've got pollen in your tank that you're using for irrigation, it might mean that you might have to clean your tank out once every 10 years if you've got a tank. So and cleaning a tank out is a bit of a pain in the butt, but it just might mean that you've got a bit more tank maintenance down the road. So if you don't have to worry about health and safety because you're not drinking it, then you just, and if you're using the water, like if your tank is draining every year in the garden, like you're using all your water up, then in many ways, you're actually sort of draining that pollen, that compost tea out into your garden. That's okay. That's okay. Does that help answer your question?
Oh, I think I've muted her.
Oh, it's okay.
There she is.
Yeah, it actually, it really does. The only other quick question I had was when I was looking at your chart about potable and non-potable, we use like a sort of drip irrigation with some sort of very low spray hoses. I take it there's no danger to irrigating food crops with material that has some debris or pollen from the house.
Not really. No, I mean, you think about your food crops have got pollen on them from the same thing that's landed on your roof, and the rain has got the same thing in the air shed, and then you've got everything in the soil. So yeah, you don't have to worry about it. Put it into sort of a realistic perspective, and you're just fine.
All right, I have one more question here for you. Let's see. It's from Virginia. Are you there, Virginia?
No.
There we are, Dave.
Okay, great. So not a question, a comment about first flush systems. We've had a potable water collection system for about 20 years here on Galiano. We initially installed a first flush system. We found it to be basically a total waste of time and money. The nature of the rainfall here being long periods of light rain rather than heavy downpours meant that the first flush system was constantly working and constantly plugging up. So we just got rid of it, and we filter at the top of the tank.
Yep.
And just keep those filters clean, and then we stop collecting during pollen season for, as you mentioned, Gord, a couple or 3 weeks.
Yep, perfect. That's a good way of doing it, and I think that is that's not uncommon to the way I normally design my systems as well. So for potable systems, but yeah, no, that makes total sense. And the nice thing is that you're aware of it, and you're aware that, okay, hey, you know what, this is a time to not do the collection, and yeah, well, that's great.
All right, good to move on.
Okay. So I'm going to move on from first flush diverters, and I am not going to focus too much on this because I think I already talked about the idea of a bypass on that picture that I showed earlier. So I'm going to move on from this. This is a system that's just going in a couple weeks ago, and basically you've got your bypass first flush diverter here with a little hole drilled in it. The eaves or the gutters aren't hooked up to it yet, which will hook up to this pipe. But as Dave noted, he's got a filter on the top of his tank. There's many different types of filters. This is a filter I use, and the water comes in, the water drains into the tank. It's nicely filtered. And if for some reason this filter gets gummed up with something and there's too much water coming in, it can overflow out. And then I've got an overflow in the tank. But yeah, so you can have it on. It can be a simplified system. It can be a bit more complex. Yeah, this is a smaller system. Same sort of idea. Just a tiny little first flush diverter, and same sort of filter system. Overflow, and then everything here is sealed. So I've got gutter guards up here. Everything here is sealed, so little things can't get into it. This is also sealed, and as it overflows, I've got a little a valve down here, just a little hinge valve, a backwater valve, so that if there's no water flowing, it's normally closed. And that way, if something, and in this case, it's going to be an otter, I'm not going to have an otter that's going to crawl up the pipe and crawl into the system because there's a little flap right here. So that just sort of gives you an example of how we deal with a nice sealed, simple system. A little bit more of a complex system, and I will move on from here. In your tank, if you are bringing water into your tank, one of the things that is usually at the bottom of your tank, there's usually a little bit of sediment. If it used to be thought that if there is sediment at the bottom of your tank, it was bad, but the actual research, the science is showing that it's actually really useful to have some sediment at the bottom of your tank because it's actually an anaerobic layer. And that sediment is actually performing a cleaning function inside your tank. And so if you have a tank and if you've got an inch or less of sediment, 2.5 centimeters or less of sediment, that is okay. If you're starting to get, more than that, then it's a good time to give your tank a clean. But don't be scared of sediment in the bottom of your tank. Also, don't be scared of the biofilm that builds up on the side of your tank, because that is also cleaning your water and it's beneficial for your tank. So just because there's biofilm here and sediment here, there's nothing to be nervous of or scared of. Some people will put a little bit of chlorine bleach in their tank once a month, and that is not what I do. I like to try and keep a little bit of the other life in the tank there for its useful purposes. And if you're putting chlorine in here, then I think then you're actually hindering some of the filtration and some of the treatment that your tank actually performs. Not that we're trying to keep our tank like a septic tank, but the same thing occurs in a water tank as a septic tank, and that is the water comes in And then as the water goes out, but there's a period of time where this water is in contact with oxygen, in contact with biology, and that actually helps clean and clear the water. So don't be scared of a little bit of sediment or film on the sides of your tanks. Storage. One of the things I do not have a slide on, but I will point to it on this slide, is if you are, say, dealing with high organics in your tank and you're trying to adjust for some of those organics because you haven't been able to adjust for it in other ways, is you can have an air diffuser in your tank, and it just allows more air or water turnover and more aeration at the top of your tank. So air diffusers are something I put into every system I do, but it's not critical, it's not necessary, but it is something I do. And the other thing I said on the earlier slide is that when you have an overflow in any drains, that downstream of any drain system of your tanks is you have a backflow preventer, a swing check backflow preventer, so that critters can't climb up, frogs, snakes, lizards, otters, whatever, slugs. You don't want them climbing up and getting into your tank. So having a swing check valve downstream of where all your connections are is a really, really good idea. And it doesn't have to be expensive. Storage and sizing. So I'm going to sort of veer off this slide a little bit in my discussion, in that when we look at water use, and if we look at what people use inside their houses to what people use outside their houses for irrigating food, we use a lot more water to irrigate our gardens and orchards than we do use for inside the house. And so if you are collecting rainwater primarily for irrigating large areas, then you have to think that you're going to be using and needing a lot of collection area. If you are collecting rainwater to irrigate some of your garden for some of the year, and then supplementing that with a well or municipal water or other things, and on Galiano it's going to be a well, then it's important that you don't tie your well system into your rainwater system, that they're two separate systems. And I'll talk on that a little bit later in a slide. But we want to keep our rainwater system separated from, if we're doing irrigation, separate from our other water system that we're used to do irrigation. There are exceptions, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But in terms of sizing, basically what we want to do is we want to do a water budget. We need to know how much water we're going to collect. We need to know what our catchment area is that we're collecting from and what our monthly precipitation is. And between knowing what we are going to use a month, what we can collect a month, that allows us to determine what size of storage that we need. And storage being expensive is one of those things where we will have to try and balance our needs and our wants. Many different types of storage, and I'm just going to race through these. But you can go with steel tanks that are lined with sealers. If you've got a crawl space, there's things that are called rainwater pillows or water pillows or bladder tanks. You can use those in crawl spaces, so it gives you access to spaces to store water where you might not otherwise be able to store them. They've been in use since the Vietnam War, when these things used to store fuel. They now make them out of potable water grade materials, so it's not dangerous to even have a drinking water system. Storage tanks are expensive though, and this is going to be a little outdated. So you're probably going to spend about $4 a gallon for a metal storage system. And it usually takes a specialized team to erect it that's done them before, and depending on the size, you'll need to have a foundation, and that can be most likely a concrete foundation. So it gets to be expensive. All the rainwater systems, I've never had a customer go with a metal storage tank. The most common tanks, and you've seen this picture before, because you've seen this section before in another picture, this is just a simple HDPE tank. These really are the most cost-effective tanks for pretty much any system. And they're sized in such a various range of sizes that you can usually find a suitable size or get a number of these that meet your size needs. This is the most common thing that I use. And but because they're black or green, you don't want to go with a white one because a white one allows too much UV light in and will cause algae growth. So you want something ideally that's black, but that means you want to keep it in the shade. Otherwise, it gets super hot, and sometimes that in itself is best to try and keep the temperature down. Concrete tanks are great. They're expensive. They're heavy. If you are using a concrete tank, in this picture here, you see that the people have put down road base as their base here. And on many tank systems, road base is great, but on concrete tanks, road base will destroy your concrete tank. And the reason why is that road base is compacted. And if you don't have your road base perfectly level, then what happens is the concrete tank sits on here, and if part of the ground under here compresses, then there becomes a pivot point in the tank, and the tank splits in half. So if you are using concrete tanks, use pea gravel. Do not use road base. Really, really important. It'll save you a ton of money. And a concrete tank, if you're using it for potable water, you can either order a potable water concrete tank, or you can order a concrete tank or pour a concrete tank, and then you can seal it with Zypex, which is a sealer that can go inside a concrete tank that's good for sealing the tank, and also it's potable water certified. But concrete's great. Ponds are the cheapest way of storing rainwater. They can be clay lined ponds. They can be lined with different liners. This is our pond. We tried to seal it with clay. After 4 years of trying to seal it with clay, we then went to a liner. As I complained to my wife as to why we weren't able to hold water in our clay pond despite it being 2 feet thick of clay, she said it was because it was man-made, and she said if it was woman-made, it would have retained water just fine. Thank you. So that's why we went to the liner. Her recommendation, and it's worked well. If you are putting a pond in, you need to think about soil movement and bylaws, and depending on if you're building up the edges of your pond, you'll have to think about, what the size of your pond is. Most ponds aren't going to need to worry about water licensing or impacting hydrology, but this system here that you see is a client's pond, where they dug a hole for their pond. They were in central Saanich. They moved their soil to their neighbors. Because there's a soil bylaw movement ban, their pond got stuck for 2 years in red tape when a neighbor complained to them. So anyways.
I just have a really quick comment about storage, Gord, for a moment,
yes.
Which is that at our Millard Learning Center here on Galiano Island, we have examples of 3 of those different types of storage solutions. We have an HDPE cistern hooked up to our office, collecting rainwater off the roof there. I can tell from your presentation, Gord, that we need to add a couple features to it to kind of bring it up to snuff, but it's working. And you can see it there. We've also built a Ferro cement cistern. So it's a cement construction of a cistern, but it's very thin walled. And so the cost is lower than a poured cement tank. We were able to build it for just under $5,000, and it holds 13,000 gallons of water. And so in terms of price per gallon, it's very good. However, that's because the labor was primarily volunteer labor. And so those are really labor intensive systems. But interesting construction there. And then, you were going to say something about Ferro cement?
No, go ahead.
The last thing is that we just installed a liner wetland, not specifically for rainwater storage, but for red-legged frog habitat. last fall, and we have a video of that on our YouTube channel, a time lapse of it. But it was pretty cool. If you have questions about installing those kinds of things, you can definitely come to us at the Conservancy, and we can at least share our experience, and you can see what they look like.
That's excellent. Yeah, Ferro cement. I do like Ferro cement. I've never installed one because my systems, unfortunately, the engineering on one for me, because I have to go through usually the permitting process, is and the seismic stability. So that impacts me being able to use a Ferro cement system. But I think Ferro cement works great. I make garden beds out of them. Concrete is heavy. Tanks float. Metal is heavy. If you are burying a tank in the ground, you have to think about buoyancy. And just as steel boats float, this is from last week where a client popped a tank in and I went out to go do the install and they hadn't put a drain in and the concrete tank was floating. So if you are burying a tank, you will need to either go online and figure out how much weight you need to put on top of your concrete tank, or you'll need to have someone tell you how much weight you need to put on your concrete tank to stop it from floating. But yeah, buoyancy can be a big issue if it's going into a hole that's not drained. I'm not going to go into basic pond details because it sounds like, Adam, you guys are a great resource for that. So I will scoot through this slide quickly with just a word. In the bottom of our pond, we have a burp valve. So if any gases can collect underneath the liner, they can burp through and we don't get this pocket of gas or air underneath the liner. When our liner goes in, we have a trench that goes around the outside. Basically, it's an anchor trench and we backfill it, and that stops the liner from sliding into the pond. And then when you're designing a pond, you want to make sure that you've got the ability for the pond to drain. And if there's a really big rain event, you want to make sure that there's a spillway that can drain the pond so that it doesn't rinse away the edges of your pond if you've got any sort of raised berms that make up your pond. But anyways, that there's a lot of good information out there. This is what our pond looks like now after a few years. And they are beautiful, they are habitat. And we actually use this pond here to gravity feed down to our nursery. And we water our complete nursery all year out of this pond, or all summer out of this pond, just gravity fed. So ponds are an excellent form of storage and a lot cheaper than any tank system. Other regulations, I won't go into that. But you may want to check with Islands Trust if you are putting a pond in, just to see if there's anything you need to be aware of. That's probably really the most important takeaway point from that slide. Storage, figuring it out. I'm going to say up front that if you want to figure storage out, the easiest way to do it, because it can be complex, you can be high level or you can be really detail oriented. But online, if you check for storage calculators online, I'm going to move past the precipitation to the storage calculators. We'll back up here. I will back up for a moment. If you do a search on Google for a rainwater calculator, it will basically allow you to put in your monthly precipitation numbers, your water budget for irrigating, whether that's your potable water budget or whether that's based on the amount of irrigation you're going to use for your garden or your orchards. And then it allows you to play around and come up with what your potentially monthly collection amount is going to be, and allows you then to balance what your needs are to what your financial needs are to pay for the storage. So online calculators are probably the easiest way to approach this. What you're about to see is just sort of a really quick run through as to how I do mine. So as before, I mentioned I use the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium to get my rainfall data. It's detailed information, I like it. Then what I do is that gives me what my average monthly precipitation is. I will put in what the square area of my catchment system is. And this is just my calculator. But this just basically goes through the process. Then I figure out what my water budget is going to be. This is for indoor usage. I also have a little calculator for irrigation usage, but this is just for indoor as an example. And so how much water is used by your washing machine, your sink, how many flushes a day go through your toilet. And that will give me what my potential monthly collection will be. So, and the next slide will show what my usage is going to be. So basically what I'm doing is I'm figuring out the water coming in, the water that's stored, the water that's overflowing, the water that's used, what's my balance, what's on my cistern for the next month, and if I've got a shortfall. My little calculator is more complex than most of the ones you'll see online. Online, they're going to be a lot simpler. That is totally cool. And it's even better if they can give you a little graph. So this is a graph that basically shows the area here that's under this line that's blue is my rainfall totals. These bars, these dark blue bars is my cistern total. These orange bars tell me what my overflow is. This is my indoor usage. This dotted line is my indoor usage. This line down at the bottom is my irrigation usage. When I combine them together, this gives me what my total usage is. So it allows me to determine what my water is going to look like. And when I play around with my cistern balance or the size of my roof catchment area, these things on my screen all change around, as do they do on any of the online water calculators, and allows you to determine if you need to supplement with, say, some of your well water. And so these bars here, which I think are going to be reddish pink, I'm colorblind, so my apologies for the wrong color, but it allows me to know when I might need to add some additional water to my system. But online calculators, they make it really simple. Use them. They're a great tool. And so that is all. That was just to get to this slide that says use online calculators. It's simple. If you are topping up a rainwater system and with, say, a well to give you additional supply, if there's not enough rainwater to meet your needs. So for example, if we look at the little frame on the right-hand side, we have a tank. The water is low. Say it's in the summertime. Oh, I'll back up. It's in the summertime and we need irrigation water. We might need to fill that up from a well. So little top-up valves can be used for that. The critical takeaway point out of everything on this slide, the critical takeaway point, if you're using a top-up valve and the outlet of the top-up valve needs to be above the overflow outlet. So what happens is this valve, there's always an air gap between where the water comes out and the highest water level in the tank. And the reason you need to have that air gap is for something we call cross connection. And it means that you cannot contaminate. If for some reason you were to contaminate the water in this tank, it wouldn't have a chance to backfeed into the rest of the system. And I'm going to really quickly give an example that happened here in Saanich. There was a system that went in. It was actually the person was doing tanning. So they had a water system. It was actually a hose, and the hose was sitting inside their tanning solution. And the regional water supply folks came to flush out the water lines on the streets. And when they flushed it, it sucked in the fluids from the tanning solution. And those fluids got sucked into the main water line. And what happened was someone down the road had hair coming out their tap. And so they went back and they flushed it again and they got more and more and more. And that's when they found out that someone didn't have an air gap between their stored water and the water that was going in. And when there was a change in pressure, they just got sucked in and contaminated the water system. So it's kind of a sick story, but it's sort of important. I've talked about making sure that we don't have things that creep back into our tanks. So this is a backflow. This is a swing check backflow valve for a big system, but it can be as simple as a piece of screening that stops things from wanting to crawl in and crawl up into the tank and crawl in through the overflow. Or you can buy fancy stuff, but the whole idea is that you want to make sure that critters cannot come from any of the overflow and drains and crawl into your tanks. Really, really important. If you are connecting tanks together, you want to make sure that there's some flexibility between the tanks. Otherwise, you can snap pipes and lose all your water storage. And that flexibility is as simple as cutting your pipe and putting in a rubber coupler, and in this case, 2 rubber couplers. So if one tank wants to adjust because of weight, that it's got some flex in there and it's not going to cause problems. I'm not going to go into a water safety plan, other than to say that if you are hiring a professional and you are putting in a potable system in, you will see a water safety plan as part of the file that goes to the building official. And it covers all aspects of the system design. And let's see, again, design drawings. You saw a picture of this tank early on. There's a small little system, but design drawings can be as simple as a sketch that a future homeowner, or if it's at a community garden, someone in the community garden group is able to understand what's there and what it's doing. So it can be a simple sketch, or it can be a more comprehensive design drawing. And with my design drawings generally, or professional design drawings, you're going to see your water budget. You're going to see all your graphs. It's basically going to lay out everything in a visual format. You've seen that picture before. We're going to move on. I'm just going to see what time it is. I'm going to move on to, I'm not going to focus on pumping, because pumping is a big topic in supply. But if you're dealing with irrigation, your pumps can be as simple as a $200 pump, or you can gravity feed. If you are gravity feeding to, say, some irrigation lines, you want to use fittings, irrigation fittings that are designed for low pressure systems like 8 PSI systems to best use the gravity. For every 1 foot of water you have in a tank, there's about a 0.4 of a pound. So if you want to have, say, 30 pounds or 40 pounds of pressure for your irrigation system, you would have to have 0.4, you'd have to have about, what's that, 100 feet of water? 10 times, yeah. So, anyways, but for non-potable systems, if you're doing any sort of irrigation and you're dealing with micro sprays or anything like that, it's not a bad idea to do a really coarse filter of about 150 microns. And you can find these filters inside of any irrigation stores. They can be banjo filters, they can be strainers, don't have to be complex, but if you're down to 150 microns, that means you're not going to be gumming up any of your your spray emitters. Treatment of potable, I will say that your treatment system is going to be robust, and it's going to have to deal with quite a variety of different things. And not one thing deals with everything. But for single family residential, if you're filtering down to 5 microns and a UV system that puts out a certain amount of UV, which is 40 millijoules per centimeter squared. Sorry, that's a little bit nerdy. But if you're dealing with an appropriate UV and you're dealing with a fine enough filter, that is going to suffice for single family residential. If you're going beyond single family residential for anything that's public or multifamily residential, or commercial, then you'd have to add something like a chlorinator to the system, which is it's a bit more effort to manage. And I want to move on to water use conservation. And I'm Adam. Before I move on to water use conservation, which is about the last 5 slides, I am happy to run I'm happy to run a little bit over. I won't take up too much of your time, but if anybody has to leave at 3:30, they can. But if anybody wants to stick around for the last 5 slides, I'm happy to continue going and getting the slides done.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Gord. There's so much information, but I think you've presented us with a lot of really good stuff for rainwater harvesting. So yeah, if folks do need to move on, you know, thank you.
So you're welcome. And so this is just to capture your attention. So this is a picture of me in my happy space. This is my humanure compost toilet compost pile after it has sat for 2.5 years, and I am digging in my own poo, and I'm ready to start to utilize it. Yeah, so like I say, I'm about as happy as a pig in shit. So compost toilets, they'll save between 25 and 35% of your indoor water use. So if you're trying to conserve water, compost toilets can be the appropriate use to go. Now, in 2016, I did some work with the provincial government, and I was a technical editor for the group that wrote the regulations for compost toilets and grey water in the province of BC. So as of 2016, compost toilets became legal under the sewage system regulations for people to use. And then the building code that is coming out, the 2021 building code, is catching up to the Ministry of Health's standards that they set in place, and they have composting toilets in the new BC building code for 2021. So composting toilets are moving forward. If you are watering, some of the ways that you can conserve water is you can do short, intense, deep watering and to your plants. And what that does is that helps train the roots to go deeper. And it means that when the roots are deeper, they have access to water. It means that they're more able to deal with periods of stress. When we are irrigating with our gray water, we use mulch basins and send gray water to these tree wells. I should have a picture coming up, I think. Gray water is another way of conserving water, but I'm going to give a real quick story to gray water use. So when we built our house, the average person uses about 300 liters of water per person per day. That's a lot of water. I mean, that's really hard to fathom. What we did is we got a research grant and we measured all our energy and water systems and everything for a year. And we were using, in our house here, we were using 40 liters of water per person per day. We were really, really conservative on how much water we used. And we set up all these gray water systems so that any of the water that we used went out to water plants. Now, this is an interesting thing. What happened with us is because we were so conservative in the water that we used inside the house, we weren't making enough gray water to water the plants. So we actually ended up having to use rainwater and well water to make up and water the plants. So gray water isn't necessarily going to save you from using water, but it will use your water more beneficially for the ecology around you. So it's kind of an interesting thing because it seems counterintuitive. Gray water is all about conservation and ecology, but you can be too conservative. If you're planting, use really deep mulches. We use mulches around our fruit trees that is 6 inches, 8 inches deep. And so really, really deep mulch. And what we do around the base of a tree is we take an old plant pot, we cut the base out, we cut a slit in the side, we wrap it around the trunk. The mulch comes up to the plant pot, but there's an air gap between the plant pot and the tree trunk so that we don't have critters that want to chew in the bark. So that way we can get away with using really deep mulches, low flow fittings, and behavior. And your behavior is everything. And I'm gonna, another story from the behavior around water use. When we were trying to teach the kids how to have really short showers, I'd come home from doing rebar on a person's house and I was filthy. And I walked in the door and everybody looked at me and they just were aghast at how dirty I was. And I thought, here is a learning moment, a teaching moment. And so I said to the kids, I said, okay, you guys, let's go read the water meter. You guys record how much water there, what the water meter is now. I'll go and have a shower. If everybody says that I'm clean after I have a shower, we'll go back and we'll read the water meter and we'll record how much water it took for me to get clean. And I'll make you guys a deal. The kids were, I think, 9 and 7 at the time. And I said, if you guys can have a shower and come out clean and use less water than me, then I'll make sure that anytime you do that, that we'll have ice cream and pizza for dinner. And I went in, I used about 1/3 of a gallon of water because there's no damn way I'm feeding my kids pizza and ice cream. So I didn't even get hot water in my shower. I came out, I was clean. We went to read the water meter. It was a 0.3 of a gallon. But after about the 6th time of having pizza and ice cream for dinner because the kids beat me in my water use, I gave up on that. But that is, behavior is a critical thing. Gray water, not all gray water is gray water. Kitchen water coming out of your sink is called dark gray water, and you have to treat it differently than the stuff that comes out your laundry or your showers. But there's a couple main rules about gray water, because gray water does have potential pathogens in it. Is you don't want to apply gray water above the ground. You don't want to apply it to vegetables, because if you do have pathogens in it, the pathogens can get taken up into vegetable tissue. So you want to apply it to things like woody tree species and things like that. Hazelnuts love gray water. Figs love gray water. Don't apply gray water to blueberries, because blueberries like acidic water and gray water is actually slightly basic. You don't want to store your gray water for more than 24 hours because it becomes kind of black water. I won't talk about the different gray water systems because that would be a different workshop altogether.
One thing really quickly is that if folks want to see the simplest possible branched gray water system, we have one at the Conservancy office as well. It's a simple branch drain system. It is subsurface. There's no pressurization or anything. It feeds some fig trees in mulch basins. So
perfect.
The simplest possible system, but as far as I can tell, it's perfectly legal and perfectly functional.
Yep, and that's basically what we do. Is we have gravity-fed branch drain systems. We also have a worm filter system that deals with all our kitchen water. So any fats, food particles, and everything, they go through worms on the way to basically irrigate an orchard. And we have, we have a variety of different systems. This is what one of our branch drain systems looks like here. We have an upside down plant pot in mulch. We have a pipe that's got a little elbow on it, and there's an air cavity from where the gray water comes out to where the gray water goes in. And once a year, we can pop the plant pot up and just make sure that everything is nice and clean and tidy under there. And if it is, then we can put the plant pot back down, put the mulch back around it, and we're ready to go. Nice and simple. This is a worm basin that we use, or a worm filter that we use for our kitchen sink. We have a whole PDF, I think it's about 6 pages of PDF on how to make them. That's free on our website. This is gray water that's coming from the worm bin that is basically coming down to a fruit tree. And this is 1/4 inch drip irrigation tubing. So it tells you how well the worms filter the water. And in swales, you can definitely, we basically take water and we try and slow it down, spread it out, and sink it in. So these swales here, these wood chips are about 3 feet thick. We've got food planted in these, happens to be some fig terraces. But if we can get the water into the ground, then we're able to better utilize it and store it in the soils. And we try and keep a good amount of soil biology going. the more carbon that you have in your soil, the more water you can store in your soil, because the carbon has a strong ability to attach to water molecules. And the more little creatures that we have in our soil that have happy faces like this, the better. I like to think that bacteria are like little water balloons. And when one of these guys comes along and eats a water balloon, they pop the balloon, and that's moisture in the soil. So having a really healthy, biodiverse soil is critical. And we also have our book, Composting Toilets, which is published by New Society Publishing on the island just north of you from on Gabriola. And I am going to end there, and I am open to any questions that pop up. That was a really speedy run through of some really big topics at the end there. So feel free, Adam, to shoot through. I'm going to quit sharing my screen.
Thank you, Gord. That was fantastic. And in some ways, those last few slides talking about all the water conservation are the most important ones. They're so doable, and they have so many other benefits. And so thank you for sharing those. Some really great ideas, especially the vermicompost, cleaning out the gray water from your sink. It's something that we'll have to try. If it's all right for you to take a few questions, it looks like we
Absolutely.
have at least one to start. And just for folks who are leaving, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to post this entire presentation on our YouTube channel coming up, so you'll be able to refer to it. I did post his Gord's slides at the beginning, but I'll repost them. And then I posted a little survey down here in the chat for you to fill out if you have a few minutes. That helps us plan future events like these and put them on for you. So thank you so much for attending. And without further ado, Susan Beck has a question for you.
We'll need to unmute you, Susan. There you go.
There we go. So Gord, my water tanks, I noticed in yours the input is up high and the output is down low. Mine, they're both down low. Is there any reason for either of those?
It's just design. Every system I design is a little bit different. I have some of the systems where the water comes in low and then it rises up into a pipe and goes into the tank. It's called a wet system.
Mm-hmm.
And the wet systems, if not done properly, they can be prone to freezing and breaking and doing what we might classify
that's exactly what happened last year.
So yeah, this is kind of like the Texas syndrome. And so what you find is that I don't know anybody really that is still using a wet system. It's sort of it's a little bit of an older way of doing things, but there's been a lot of problems, and it's certainly not something that's recommended in our climate. So if you do have a wet system, the most important thing is to make sure that it is well insulated, and that after it finishes raining, that the water column in the pipe can drain back out so it's not open to freezing.
Exactly. Yes, I learned that the hard way. Okay, but other than that, I'm watching for that. It's basically, it's okay. It's not.
Other than that, it's okay. So the main thing is freezing. Yep.
Good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Do we have any other questions?
Lisa.
Let's see. I'm gonna unmute everybody.
Okay, yeah, we've got that's perfect. So if everybody's unmuted, then
okay, you can now unmute yourselves, everybody. If you want to ask a question, just unmute yourselves and go ahead. There are the slides.
I can't hear. We're still muted. There we go.
There we go. I'm on Pender Island and trying to get more people to collect rainwater, do rainwater harvesting. And I know the tanks are the most expensive part of the system, and I was wondering if you have recommendations of where to buy them. I've been trying Premier Plastics or CanWest.
Yeah, there actually is. So there is a fellow on Salt Spring Island, and his name is Ronan, and
Oh,
he's
yeah.
and so Ronan actually, because I buy tanks from Premier Plastics, from Bar Plastics, from Corix, from Slags, from Van All Water. My preference is to buy them from Ronan because Ronan gets them cheaper and delivered cheaper than I can, even from buying them from Bar Plastics. So Ronan is my source for anybody in the Gulf Islands that is looking for plastic tanks.
But then doesn't he has to get them from wherever to Salt Spring and then from Salt Spring to the Gulf Islands, right?
That's true. Because he's done his own, Ronan is a really fair person. So because he doesn't charge an arm and a leg for delivery, his delivery charges make him more competitive, the most fair price of anybody. I could get a tank from Ronan delivered to Victoria cheaper than I can have one picked up at any of the stores here in Victoria. So it's always worthwhile to see, you know, what would be, you know, you phone Ronan up and say, what's the cost of getting a tank delivered to me on Pender? And because of he does so much stuff in the Gulf Islands, he just sets a day where he just delivers tanks with his truck, and it's really good.
So he'd take them right to the site.
Yep, he takes them right
Yeah.
to the site.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions out there?
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi. So we are very interested in doing rainwater harvesting on North Galiano. We have so much rainwater. We have so huge a garden. We do have adequate well water, but you know, we would like to use the rainwater because it's there. We got one quote that was about $10,000, and I'm just wondering is there any kind of association of ethical, environmentally minded contractors that you can turn to? I imagine you're quite a busy man.
Yeah. So, and $10,000 is usually pretty good. My main focus is mostly on potable systems. But the person, usually in the Gulf Islands, if it's a non-potable system, there's a fellow that also owns an irrigation company, and he is on Salt Spring. His name's Matt Knowles, and Matt is Matt's great, and Matt services quite a few islands. Super ethical. I would say that a $10,000 system is going to be it's not. I mean, it sounds expensive. It's a lot of money, but it's not a big system. So the main thing you'd want to do is you'd want to make sure of anybody you choose that you are able to contact one of their prior clients to see how they're doing, see what the system's like. But that being said, I do know that Matt on Salt Spring, and I'm happy to give you his contact information through email, would be a good sort. And there is another young fellow that he has just left one of the retailers, and he now services the Gulf Islands for water systems. And I'm trying to remember the name of his company, but yeah, there's a few of them. I haven't heard of any bad people out there in the industry. I haven't heard of anybody that is a bad person, so that's a good sign. Nobody's got a bad reputation.
That's great. Thank you, Gord. That's really helpful. And the whole presentation was really excellent. I'm going to recommend it to some of my neighbors who couldn't tune in today. I just have one final question. Sometimes when you're discussing rainwater harvesting, someone will argue that you're taking water out of the aquifer, that you're diverting it, so it's not necessarily a positive environmental benefit. I'm wondering what your reaction is to that.
I would say that in our climate, it's not one of those things that we really have to worry about the consideration of. We have like right now, what we're doing is we have we got houses that are built, and the houses have their perimeter drains and storm drains, and it usually takes that flow out and distributes it somewhere else. And unless you've got the ability to take that water and put it into a seep pit or a rain garden or some way to slow the water down and allow it to sink in, you're basically creating a flow of water that is going elsewhere. And when you have, for example, if you have like a really heavy rainfall, what happens is this doesn't sink in super quickly. It actually goes across and it fills up our ditches and it runs down our roads and it goes out to the ocean. So the place that where we live, it's not really such a critical, it's not a critical thing. And it was definitely something that the provincial government was wondering about. And, but if we are able to use that water for irrigation, then we're sinking it in. If we're able to use that water and it's going into a septic system, we're actually sinking it in. If we're taking that water and we're doing other items, because we collect it, we store it, and then we use it a little bit rather than just let it flood all away. It's actually a bit of an ecological. We're better able to keep it on the property and used on the footprint where it lands. We're just using it in a different way. So hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yes, thank you. That's really helpful.
Welcome.
And I'll just chip in and say that as far as I understand, about 80% of our water on Galiano runs straight off into the ocean during the winter season. And so, you know, for the most part, if you're catching it, you're actually distributing it throughout the season better than it's currently being distributed.
Yeah. Any other questions out there?
I have one last question about
Sure.
composting toilets. Actually, I ordered your book and it's on its way. I'm very excited.
It's a good bathroom read.
Yes, indeed. I look forward to it. But maybe a guilty bathroom read until you get it built. But in any case, you mentioned that it's now going to be included within the building code and legal. Is that correct?
Yeah. So right now it's already legal. Since 2016, it was added into the septic, the sewerage system regulations, which is the same regulations that govern the design and install of septic systems, of wastewater systems. So it has been legal since 2016. That being said, the sticking point that has occurred with compost toilets versus septic systems is that septic systems have always existed completely outside of the house. And with a compost toilet, there's two parts to it. There's the part inside the house and there's a part outside the house. And the part inside the house is what is governed by the building officials, the inspectors. And they have been, some of them can be very forward thinking, some of them can be very conservative. And so there has been some issues with some building officials, but usually what has happened in every case that I've been involved in is that the building officials have given way to the compost toilet, because it's Island Health that governs wastewater, septic, sewage, and that sort of stuff. So with the building code in 2021 that should be released in about 4 or 5 months, it catches up to what the Ministry of Health had done back in 2016.
That's excellent. Does your book address those changes at all, or?
Doesn't address those changes. My book, I think 2018 was where, just before it came out, there was, in the US, there is IAPMO, which is a professional association of plumbers and mechanical engineers. And they wrote a code called the WE Stand, which is the Water Efficiency Standard, which governs all of the US. And that water efficiency standard has compost toilets in it. And at the time that I actually went into the book and re-added that to the book, because it was actually at the editor, and we added that in because the WE Stand came out. And at the time, the only system in the US that had actually gone through, the only compost toilet system that had actually gone through and been approved under the WE Stand was a community human manure system of several houses and a central composting facility tied to it. So when we start to see the US do things, it's usually not too long before we see Canada jump in.
Right on. Well, those are exciting developments for sure.
Yeah, it's good.
Do we have any other questions for Gord?
Mhm.
I think we've exhausted them.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much again, Gord, for joining us. It was just incredibly informative. And
You're welcome.
I hope I get to visit your mud house one day.
Yeah, when COVID's all done, perhaps perhaps we'll be able to be social again. Oh my goodness. Yeah, strange times, but well, Adam, I will suggest that if anybody does have any questions that end up on your lap or they want to contact me directly, they're more than welcome to give me an email. I'm totally fine to answer any questions that pop up after the fact.
Excellent. That's really generous of you. I will definitely forward people on to you if they have questions that we cannot answer.
Great.
And if folks want to see our demonstration facilities at the Millard Learning Center, you're always welcome to come visit and see them for yourselves.
Thanks
Great.
very
Well,
much, Gord. It was
Yeah,
great.
thank you. You're welcome. And thank you, everybody. It's despite not being there in person, it's just been a pleasure to be able to talk on something that I'm passionate about.
Thank you so much, Gord. Hope to meet you in person one day.
Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent.
Bye now.
Take care, everybody. Hope to see you next
Bye-bye.
week.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Adam.
great. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.